This is for you, my shining light. May it make your journey a little happier. There are many things in this world that inspire fear. A roiling thunderstorm, the yawning chasm of a cliff's edge, the unsettling certainty that you've forgotten something important but cannot for the life of you remember what. High on that list traditionally was a dragon. Dragons, by reputation, were to be treated with the utmost dread. They torched kingdoms. They devoured livestock. They sat atop mountains of plundered gold and ancient jewels. Their enormous bodies coiled around treasure so vast and glittering that even the boldest of knights would momentarily forget their purpose upon first beholding it and just sort of stand there with their mouths open, doing their best impression of a very armored fish. Mortifax the Terrible was technically a dragon. He had the scales deep green, with a faint and frankly unnecessary iridescence. He had the wingspan impressive, though he rarely used it since flying gave him what he described as a condition, which he declined to elaborate upon. He had the fire breath reliable, if somewhat inconsistent in terms of temperature, sometimes a roaring inferno, sometimes more of a strongly worded warm gust. He had the name Mortifax the Terrible, which he had chosen himself at the age of 43, after rejecting Mortifax the Dreadful, too theatrical, Mortifax the Unspeakable, too much to live up to, and Mortifax the Quite Concerning, which his mother had suggested, and which was, honestly, perfect, but that was exactly why he couldn't use it. What Mortifax did not have was a hoard worth speaking of. Or rather, he had a hoard. He had an enormous hoard. He was very serious and very passionate about his hoard. He simply had different ideas about what constituted hoard-worthy material. The cave he occupied, carved into the eastern face of Mount Arath, which was frankly a very solid and respectable mountain and deserved better, was filled, floor to ceiling, with an astonishing collection of objects that no sane being would have crossed the street for, let alone a mountain range. There were chairs, dozens of them, all broken in some way. A three-legged stool that listed dramatically to the left, a high-backed dining chair with a cracked spindle, and a seat that had been repaired so many times with such wildly different materials that it had achieved a sort of patchwork sentience, and occasionally made decisions about whether to support you without consulting anyone. A rocking chair that rocked on an uneven axis and had, during a memorable visit from a confused tax collector, managed to eject its occupant 6 feet across the cave. There were spoons, an almost unfathomable number of spoons, wooden ones, metal ones, one carved from bone that Mortifax claimed had a compelling narrative and refused to elaborate, spoons with bent handles, spoons that were inexplicably sticky despite having been cleaned, spoons that were so large they could only be described as agricultural implements that had simply given up and become spoons. A single ladle that Mortifax had classified as an honorary spoon, which the ladle did not seem to appreciate. And then there were the rocks. The rocks, Mortifax would have you know, were not just rocks. They were mildly interesting rocks. The distinction mattered enormously to him and very little to everyone else. There was a flat gray one that was almost perfectly oval but not quite, which is the interesting part. There was a reddish one with a white streak through it that he found evocative somehow. There was one that looked from a particular angle in a particular light after you'd had a difficult day and your eyes were tired, vaguely like a rabbit. He had named that one Gerald. Gerald had pride of place on the central rock shelf, which Mortifax had constructed himself from other, less interesting rocks. This had been a philosophically fraught project. He had also, in a subcategory he called miscellaneous acquisitions of particular note, accumulated 17 candlesticks of varying heights with no candles, a wagon wheel with several spokes missing, 4.5 pairs of boots, the half being a single boot of indeterminate ownership and troubling dampness, a clock that had stopped at 3:10, and which Mortifax insisted was still correct twice a day, and a tapestry depicting a hunting scene from which all the hunters had been lovingly and very carefully cut out, leaving only the confused-looking deer. He was very happy. This was, to the outside world, the most baffling part. The first adventurer arrived on a Tuesday, which is the worst day for anything, but especially for quests. His name was Aldrich Swiftblade, a name he had earned through a series of moderately impressive sword exhibitions at a regional fair, and which he now regretted because it had led him here, halfway up a mountain, with chafing in places he would not specify, pursuing a dragon whose name sounded extremely promising. The terrible part, specifically. That was what had sold him. In the tavern in the valley below, a perfectly adequate tavern called the Limping Ox, which described both the establishment's structural integrity and the owner's primary complaint. Aldrich had heard the legend of Mortifax's hoard. He had heard it from a man called Pip, who had heard it from a woman called Dorna, who had made most of it up based on general draconic assumptions. But this was, historically speaking, how most tavern legends worked. The hoard, according to Pip via Dorna via imagination, was vast and magnificent. Gold coins stacked to the ceiling, rubies the size of hens' eggs, sapphires, emeralds, possibly a cursed sword or two which adventurers always liked even knowing they were cursed, perhaps especially because they were cursed, because at least a cursed sword was interesting. Aldrich had sharpened his actual, blessedly uncursed sword, told his horse he'd be back by dinner. The horse had given him a look that suggested it had heard this before and planned its own evening accordingly, and marched up the mountain. He found the cave without much difficulty. The scratched-out sign reading Mortifax the Terrible, TRSPSSERS, will be dealt with in a thorough and unpleasant manner was a fairly useful landmark, as was the faint smell of scorched stone and what he could only describe as a very old closet. He stepped inside. He stopped. He looked for quite a long time. "Hello," said Mortifax from the back of the cave where he was carefully cataloging a new acquisition, a soup ladle with a slightly bent handle that he hadn't yet decided whether met the bar for honorary spoon status. He had standards. The process was rigorous. "I am Aldrich Swiftblade," said Aldrich, because he felt he ought to say something and his name was the last thing he'd had a solid handle on. "I have come to—" He looked at the chairs. He looked at the spoons. He found Gerald and stared at him for a moment. Gerald stared back insofar as rocks can stare, which is actually quite effectively if you've had a long day. "I have come to, down if you like," said Mortifax pleasantly. "Though I'd avoid the green velvet one by the third stalactite, she's treacherous." Aldrich looked at the green velvet chair, which did indeed radiate a kind of ambient hostility. "I've come for your hoard," he said, rallying. "Stand aside, beast, and— Oh, which part?" Mortifax came around the corner of a particularly impressive stack of spoons, all of which he had sorted by material and then subsorted by degree of bend. He was larger than Aldrich had expected, which was saying something, because Aldrich had expected a dragon and had adjusted his expectations accordingly. "I've just done a reconfiguration. The rock section is really coming together. I moved Gerald to the elevated platform. That's the one that looks like a rabbit. Gerald, say hello, and I think the sightlines are much better now." "Gerald," said Aldrich. "He doesn't respond. He's a rock." "Right. He appreciates acknowledgement. I can tell." Aldrich sheathed his sword. Not because he was intimidated, he was somewhat, given the scales and the size and the general dragonness of the creature, but because it felt profoundly silly to have a weapon drawn at something that was currently gesturing enthusiastically at a display of bent spoons. "Where," said Aldrich carefully, "is the gold?" Mortifax blinked. His eyes were amber and enormous and contained, Aldrich noticed, absolutely no guilt whatsoever. "Gold, the treasure. You're a dragon. There's supposed to be gold. Told you that? Everyone. It's what dragons do. You collect gold." Mortifax looked genuinely baffled, which on a dragon's face was a fascinating and slightly alarming expression to observe. "Why would I collect gold? It's just metal. It doesn't do anything. You can't sit on it. Well, you can, but it's deeply uncomfortable and the coins shift around. Believe me, I tried. Very disappointing. No character whatsoever." He gestured broadly at the chairs. "Now these have character." Aldrich looked at the chairs. "That one," said Mortifax, pointing, "came from a demolished inn in the eastern provinces. 3 different owners by my estimation. Someone carved initials in the back. Someone else sanded them off, but imperfectly, so you can still see the ghost of them in good light. DP possibly a merchant, possibly a scoundrel, could be the same thing. Now isn't that more interesting than a coin? Not if I'm trying to pay rent, said Aldrich. Ah, a practical concern. Mortifax seemed to consider this with genuine sympathy. I don't have rent. It's one of the advantages of mountain living. Aldrich left. He told no one about the spoons. He wasn't sure anyone would believe him, and he suspected he barely believed himself. The second adventurer arrived 3 weeks later and made an immediately better impression on the mountain, if not on Mortifax. Her name was Seraphina, and she had earned the epithet the Bold, through an incident involving a necromancer, a swamp, and a decision that everyone around her had agreed was bold in the way that falling off a roof is bold, not so much courageous as physics-defying. She had also heard about the horde. She had heard about Aldrich's visit, too, because Aldrich had eventually told someone, and that someone had told everyone else in the manner of a stone dropped in a pond, rippling outward in ever-widening circles of embellishment. The story, by the time it reached Seraphina, was that Aldrich had bravely entered the dragon's lair, faced terrible trials, and barely escaped with his life, the gold being protected by ancient enchantments of bewildering complexity. This was not true, but it was a significantly better story than he looked at some chairs and left feeling confused, so it had naturally prevailed. Seraphina had brought equipment. A proper adventurer's kit. Rope, torches, 3 different antidotes. She was not sure for what, but experience had taught her that uncertainty was no reason to be unprepared, and a satchel she intended to fill with treasure. She also brought, for reasons that seemed sensible at the time and continued to seem sensible right up until she entered the cave, a small specialist in locks and mechanisms named Cobb, who had very nimble fingers and had not, technically, agreed to be here but owed Seraphina a favor from the swamp incident. I don't see any enchantments, said Cobb, from just behind Seraphina's left shoulder, examining the entrance to the cave with the professional skepticism of a man who had seen many enchantments and found most of them disappointingly theatrical. They might be invisible, said Seraphina. That's what people say when there aren't any. They went in. Oh, visitors. Mortifax, who was currently engaged in a very delicate operation. He had found, that morning, a spoon of unusual provenance. The handle was carved in a style he associated with coastal craftwork, but the bowl was clearly inland metalwork, suggesting either trade routes of unexpected complexity or a very confused spoonmaker, and he was composing notes on it in a leather journal he kept for exactly this purpose. Come in, come in. Mind the rocking chair. She's had a mood today. Rocking chair rocked. Cobb, who had not been warned in time, sat in it. It rocketed him sideways into a stack of 3-legged stools. He lay on the cave floor and stared at the ceiling in the manner of a man recalibrating. I warned you, said Mortifax. Well, I warned her. The timing was imperfect. Seraphina was staring at the spoon collection. She was a practical woman. She liked to find the shape of a situation before engaging with it, the way you might like to see the full layout of a battlefield before deciding where to stand. The spoon collection was, by this measure, giving her serious trouble. These are spoons, she said. Mostly, said Mortifax with the air of someone who found this distinction important. A few are technically ladles. The large wooden one is in a contested category. I'm not ready to commit. I was told you had a hoard. I do have a hoard. He seemed genuinely wounded. This is the hoard. The spoon section alone took 40 years to properly curate. Do you have any idea how many spoons exist in the world? It's frankly irresponsible. No quality control. People just make them. I'm providing a service in a sense. Stewardship. Stewardship, repeated Seraphina. Of the spoons, yes. Cobb had gotten up and was examining Gerald. Gerald, as previously established, was doing his thing. Cobb tilted his head. He had spent 15 years as a specialist in finding hidden compartments, false bottoms, and concealed mechanisms. He was looking at Gerald and wondering, not for the first time in his career, why he hadn't taken up farming. What's special about this rock? He asked. He looks like a rabbit, said Mortifax. Cobb looked at Gerald from multiple angles. No, he doesn't. From that angle, tilt your head to the left. More. Now imagine you've had a long day. Cobb tilted. He squinted. He thought about a long day. Maybe a little. he admitted reluctantly, and then felt upset with himself. There you are, said Mortifax with satisfaction. Seraphina tried several more approaches. She inquired about secret rooms. Mortifax showed her the secondary chair alcove, which contained 4 more chairs and a small shelf he was saving for a particularly significant acquisition he hadn't made yet but had a good feeling about. She asked about the tapestry. He explained the deer. She asked why the hunters had been removed. He said they'd seemed like they were having a bad influence on the composition. She asked why any of this was in a dragon's lair, and he looked at her with what could only be described as polite bewilderment, as if she'd asked why he breathed air. Because I like it, he said. What else would I keep a lair for? She took nothing. She left Cobb outside briefly while she had a quiet moment on the mountainside, just standing in the brisk wind, recalibrating her understanding of dragons, quests, and the general reliability of tavern sources. Then she walked back down. So, said Cobb. He has spoons, said Seraphina. That's it, and chairs and rocks, and what I believe was half a pair of boots, though he was quite fond of those. Cobb was quiet for a moment. The rock does look a bit like a rabbit, he said. Don't. The third visitor was not an adventurer at all, which Mortifax found refreshing, though the refreshment was short-lived. Her name was Proven's a Tale, and she was a scholar of draconic behavior from the University of Marden, which was a very good university if you were interested in things that had no practical application, and an excellent one if you had very specific things you wished to be confused about in a very credentialed way. She arrived not with a sword or a lock-picking kit, but with a notebook, several quills, a portable writing desk that she assembled in the cave entrance with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this in worse places, and an expression of such professional excitement that Mortifax initially mistook it for an ailment. Not here for the treasure, he said. It wasn't a question. She had the look of someone who had already read the report about what the treasure was and had scheduled this visit specifically because of it. I'm here because of the treasure, she said, which was technically different. She was already writing. Can you confirm that the primary collection consists of seating apparatus, cutlery of the spoon type, and geological specimens selected on the basis of mild interest? Mildly interesting rocks, Mortifax corrected. The categorization matters. There's a spectrum. This one, he indicated a brownish lump near the cave wall, is merely a rock, no interest whatsoever. Good heft, structurally sound, doing its job, no reason to celebrate it. Gerald, on the other hand. Gerald, he's in the rabbit category. Provenza wrote this down without visible judgment, which was more than most people managed. Mortifax found her immediately more agreeable than any of his other visitors. She spent 4 hours in the cave. She asked about the chairs with the interest of someone who was not pretending. She learned the provenance of 17 spoons and cross-referenced 2 of them against known trade patterns in her notebook, with an expression of genuine scholarly engagement. She asked about the clock, and received what she later described in her published monograph as the most elaborate and internally coherent defense of broken timepieces I have encountered in 30 years of fieldwork. Mortifax showed her the secondary chair alcove. He showed her the tapestry with the huntless deer. He explained about the boot. He brought out the leather journal and read her his notes on the coastal inland spoon with the measured pride of an academic presenting a paper, which she recognized because she had attended many such presentations, and this was, genuinely, more interesting than most of them. Can I ask, she said at the end of the 4th hour, why these things, dragons typically? Gold, said Mortifax, and his enormous amber eyes did something complicated. Yes, I know. My mother collected gold. My grandfather was legendary for it. My third cousin on my father's side has a mountain in the Keth Range that is entirely gold, floor to ceiling, and he is by every draconic measure enormously successful. He paused. He is also deeply boring. I visited once. There's nothing to look at. It all just sits there glittering in a very self-satisfied way, and he sits on top of it and feels important, and nothing about any of it tells you a single thing that's worth knowing. He gestured at the room around him. That chair came from a demolished inn, 3 owners. Those initials DP, someone wanted to be remembered enough to carve their name into furniture. Someone else wanted that gone, Both of those people are dead, and that argument is still happening in the wood. The spoon with the bent handle, it was bent in use. Someone pressed too hard on something. That's a decision they made right there in the metal. These aren't just objects. They're records. Every crack and stain and imperfect repair is a record of something that happened. Gold doesn't do that. Gold just sits there and says, look how much of me there is. There was a silence. Gerald, said Provenza carefully, is also a record. Gerald is a rabbit, said Mortifax. He doesn't have to do everything. Provenza's monograph, published the following year under the title Hoarding Behavior in Non-Standard Draconic Collectors, a case study, became required reading in 3 departments and was cited in 14 subsequent papers. She dedicated it to Mortifax with a footnote acknowledging Gerald. Gerald did not respond. He was a rock. But Mortifax placed the monograph on the elevated shelf beside him, and if the arrangement looked something like pride, well, there was no one in the cave to see it. The 4th visitor arrived in an official capacity, which is always the worst way to arrive anywhere. His name was Terence Vell, and he represented something called the Regional Draconic Assessment Office, which was a department Mortifax had not known existed, and which, upon reflection, he felt could have comfortably continued not existing for the remainder of time. Terence wore a badge. He carried a clipboard. He had the expression of a man who had seen many things assessed and had found none of them satisfactory, and he looked at Mortifax's cave in a way that suggested this trend would continue. Article 7 of the Draconic Ordinances, Terence said at the cave entrance, reading from a document that appeared to be the length of a small novel. All registered dragons operating within the territorial designation of Mount Arath are required to maintain a hoard of demonstrable value, said value being defined as, "Come in," said Mortifax. Terence came in. He looked at the chairs. He made a note. He looked at the spoons. He made a longer note. He found Gerald and spent what seemed like an unnecessarily long time making a note about Gerald, which Mortifax felt was unfair to Gerald, who had done nothing wrong. There is no gold, said Terence. Correct. There are no gems, precious metals, ancient artifacts, enchanted weaponry, or other objects of recognized draconic value. There is a tapestry. It has no hunters. That's the interesting part. Terence made a note about the interesting part. His expression suggested he did not find it interesting. Mr. Mortifax, Mortifax the Terrible, are regulations. A dragon's hoard serves a function in the regional economy. Adventurers come to retrieve it. This generates. 2 adventurers came, said Mortifax. They left confused. A scholar came and wrote a very well-received monograph. A tax collector came once and the rocking chair sorted him out. I don't see what the economy has to do with me. The adventurers, said Terence with the patience of a man reading from a script he deeply believed in, stimulate the local tavern trade, the quest preparation industry, the sword-sharpening sector, the boot-resoling guilds. When they come for treasure and leave with treasure, they spend it locally. When they come for treasure and leave confused, they spend less. They are confused. They shouldn't have assumed, said Mortifax. Terence looked at him. Never said I had gold, Mortifax continued. No one ever asked me. They heard Mortifax the Terrible and they imagined a cave full of gold because that is what they were taught to imagine, and then they were disappointed that reality had declined to organize itself according to their imagination. That seems like an educational failure more than a me failure. Terence's pen hovered over his clipboard. Besides, said Mortifax, they left with things. They. Aldrich, first adventurer, sword fellow, sensible boots, very tense, he left with Gerald's story. He'd never thought about rocks before. He's thought about them since. He told me in a letter. He found a rock near his home village with an unusual mineral streak, and he sent me a sketch. He indicated a drawing pinned near the tapestry. Serafina, second adventurer, competent, the small man with her had interesting lock-picking equipment. She published a brief account in an adventurer's circular that I understand was widely read. Apparently there's quite a community of people who felt adventuring wasn't for them and were relieved to hear that one of the legendary dragon hoards was mostly kitchenware. Terence made a note. His pen had slowed. Provenza wrote the monograph. It has been cited 14 times. He said this with the measured quiet of a professor mentioning a particularly successful student. That is 14 instances of people thinking carefully about why something they assumed was worthless turned out to be worth thinking about. I would argue, said Mortifax, that is a more durable economic contribution than a pile of coins that gets taken, spent, and forgotten. There was a silence. The rocking chair rocked slightly, though no one was sitting in it, which was its way. Article 7, said Terence slowly, does not define value as citation counts. Perhaps, said Mortifax, it should. Terence looked at his clipboard. He looked at the chairs. He looked at the spoon collection, which in the cave's particular afternoon light was undeniably something. It caught the light in small, different ways, each spoon its own small gleam, slightly different from the others. A dozen decisions about metal and wood and angle of use accumulated in one place. It was not gold. It was not remotely gold, but it was something. He wrote a note. He left. The Regional Draconic Assessment Office sent no follow-up. Whether this was because they reviewed Mortifax's argument and found it sufficient, or because they had misplaced his file, or because Terence had experienced an unexplained change of perspective on his way down the mountain, is not recorded. What is recorded in Provenza Tales' published correspondence, and in Aldrich's increasingly detailed rock sketches, and in a small note written in a tavern in the valley below by a woman named Pip, who had started this whole thing with an invented legend and was now somewhat awed by where it had gone, is that Mortifax the Terrible continued to collect. A normal day for Mortifax began at what the broken clock always said, 3:10. This was, he felt, an excellent time to begin a day. It had a specificity that dawn lacked. Dawn was vague. 3:10 was committed. He reviewed the collection. This was not a quick task. The spoon section alone required 20 minutes of proper looking, which was different from mere glancing and should not be confused with it. Looking meant standing in front of each one and letting it present itself to you, letting it be what it was for a moment before you moved on. He had developed this practice over 100 years and found it indispensable. The spoons, he had discovered, changed slightly depending on how you looked at them. Not physically, he was not a mystic, whatever the adventurers assumed, but in terms of what they offered you. Some days the bent-handled one was a story about someone working too hard. Some days it was just a bent spoon. The difference was in him, not in the spoon, and he found this information useful. He catalogued 3 new acquisitions from the previous week's modest expedition to the valley below. He did not raid villages. He did not terrorize markets. He walked through markets carefully. Because he was large and the stalls were not designed with dragons in mind, and he bought things with coins he had accumulated through a part-time arrangement with a local merchant who paid him to scare off bandits on the eastern road, which he did by appearing above the tree line and breathing a strongly worded warm gust in their direction. It was efficient. The bandits invariably reassessed their career choices. From this week's market, 1 wooden spoon with a crack running the full length of the handle, repaired with a strip of leather binding that was itself beginning to fray. He thought it was probably 30 years old. He thought someone had valued it enough to repair it at all, and then continued using it until the repair itself needed seeing to, and then here it was on his shelf. That was a lot of soup, 1 rock, obtained from the riverbed near the old mill. It was flat and dark with one face that caught the light in a way that was not dramatic but was persistent. It kept doing it, quietly, whenever the light shifted. He had not named it yet. He was waiting to see if it would earn a name or simply earn a place. 1 chair leg, just the leg. He had found it near a rubbish heap at the edge of the market, and had spent considerably longer than was probably reasonable trying to determine which of the chair's 4 legs it had been. It was a question without an answer, but he found the question interesting. Had it been a corner, a middle leg of a 6-legged table? Had the chair continued to function after losing it, braced against a wall somewhere, temporarily undignified? He placed it in the chair section, though it complicated the taxonomy, and felt that this was right. In the afternoon he wrote in his journal. He wrote about the coastal inland spoon's implications for trade routes. He wrote 2 paragraphs about the rocking chair's temperament, which had been stable this week. suggesting she was either satisfied or biding her time. He wrote a careful description of the light on the new riverbed rock at 3 different times of day, which produced 3 different descriptions of what appeared to be the same object, which he found instructive. He wrote a letter to Aldrich, who had sent a second rock sketch and a question about whether the streak was quartz or calcite. He did not know, but he knew a scholar at Marden who might, and he said so. He sealed the letter and set it out for the post hawk that came on Thursdays, which he had also started paying in the bandit-scaring arrangement, because it had occurred to him that the hawk was undervalued, and things that were undervalued deserved acknowledgement. He had dinner. He did not eat adventurers, which was a common misconception. He ate deer primarily and fish when the season was right, and occasionally vegetables from the valley if the merchant included them as a bonus, which happened more often than commercial logic would predict and which Mortifax suspected was kindness, though the merchant would have denied it. He sat in the cave in the evening and looked at his collection. The spoons caught the last light. The chairs held their shapes in the dimness, each one a particular kind of absence, a negative space shaped like a sitting person, the ghost of someone who had sat and risen and gone. The rocks were their best selves in this light, which was the light that wasn't trying too hard. Gerald was inscrutable as always. Gerald was always fine. Mortifax the Terrible sat in his cave full of broken chairs and catalogued spoons and mildly interesting rocks, and was content, and felt that content was the correct word, and also that it was a deeply underrated word, which was something he had in common with most of his collection. Found by the 9th adventurer, who had arrived expecting gold and left having purchased the rocking chair, which she had decided she could fix given sufficient determination and a better understanding of its personality. If you are reading this, you came looking for something valuable and found something else. This is not a failure. This is, in my experience, how most of the best things happen. The chairs are not gold. The spoons are not jewels. Gerald is not a rabbit precisely, though he is also not a rabbit, which is the interesting part. I do not know what you came for. I know what you found. You found a room full of things that someone kept, not because they were worth keeping in any ledger-approved sense, but because they were worth looking at. They were worth the weight of a second glance, which is rarer than gold and considerably more interesting. If you take anything from here, and please do not take Gerald, I will know and I will be unreasonable about it, take the habit of the second glance. It will serve you better than coins. Also, the rocking chair is manageable if you approach from the left and sit down with intent. She respects commitment. Do not hedge. With regards, Mortifax the Terrible, collector, custodian, occasional road safety consultant, author of 43 volumes of spoon notes. Thanks for listening until the end. Please like and subscribe.